Yeah, I love that you brought out punctuation because that is a subtle area where modern translations really help. I grew up with the King James, but just starting to read the New King James as I got older was so helpful because of punctuation. And that is a really subtle but very important thing. And so that's definitely something that a lot of people miss is the King James version. And another issue that you talk about, I know I've seen a video of it, is typography,
Yeah.
but it ties into that. You know, we have versification so often in the King James Version. So if you couple versification, dividing everything up into little snippets,
Yeah.
along with a very different kind of punctuation, you are really pulling people from an understanding. And this is exactly what we're talking about. You might technically say 5%, but if you start adding in punctuation and versification, it's way more than 5%.
Yeah, I do think so. And I've just had to focus on an argument that people can really grasp.
Yes.
And I find that people dismiss me so quickly when I bring up punctuation that I've just focused on words instead. But let me give an example from my own experience. I've got my iPad Pro here and Isaiah 52 in front of me. And you can call me a liar if you want out there in the internet land, but this is what really happened to me. Punctuation, the lack of contemporary punctuation conventions really did hurt me in Isaiah 52, where it says, as many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men, so shall he sprinkle many nations, the kings shall shut their mouths at him. Whereas the English Standard Version puts M dashes in the verse to set off a particular phrase. So it ends up reading like this: as many were astonished at you. I'm translating the King James into contemporary English now. So shall he sprinkle many nations. That was the comparison. And the M dashes showed me. And I had another critic who wrote lengthy articles on his blog, condemning my book. He literally just didn't understand the thing that I was saying, poor guy. And that was one thing that's kind of led me away from talking about punctuation. There are some elements of language, it's just even difficult to communicate to other people the misunderstanding that I had and how punctuation fixed it. One of the more accessible examples there, though, would be the King James does not use quotation marks. That's not their fault. The quotation marks were a brand new-ish convention back at the time, according to my researches. The King James translators would often capitalize the first word of a quotation to let you know where the quotation is starting. But I've seen even that trip people up. And I give the example in my book and in that Bible typography video of Abraham saying unto his servant who looked over all that he had, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. Well, put is capitalized because it's the start of a quotation. But a friend of mine encountered a woman who thought that that was the name of the servant of Abraham. Put, she called him, because that's what a capitalized word in the middle of a sentence means for us. It's a proper noun. So we're not blaming the King James translators. I'm not saying that woman was stupid. I'm saying she's reading according to conventions that did not exist back then. And they're not at fault either, the King James translators, because how could they know what the conventions would be in the future? Language changes.
That's right. Yeah. And another example for me personally has to do with something you talk about in your book that people use as an argument for the King James, which is the use of italicized words. And I think italicized words can be a good thing. I'm okay with it. But when you have a translation that has italicized words, one of the remarks that I would make from my own personal experience is I remember as a young person seeing italicized words and thinking you were supposed to emphasize those words when I read them, because no one taught me as a young person that those were supplied words in English. So it actually created more confusion. But you give the example in your book of how italicized words, I think it's Psalm 14, where the scripture says, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And what is it about the italicized words there that you talk about?
Yeah, I really distinctly recall being a sophomore in college, and my roommate was leading our prayer group, and he had this really cool thing to share for the nightly devotion. at our Christian college, and he said, you know, these italicized words were supplied by the translators. So look, it says, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. The there is italicized. So what it really is saying is the fool hath said in his heart, no God. So he was kind of like saying, you know, you might think that this is talking about atheists, but it's talking about any one of us anytime we disobey. You know, when we say no God, we're being fools. Well, that may be true. All of that might be true, but that's not what the passage is saying. The Hebrew demands there is, and the word for no there in Hebrew isn't the no of direct address, like when a 2-year-old is saying no to his mom. It means the non-existence of. It's a specific word. So really, those italics, okay, well, yeah, they're really fastidious, and they're a way of demonstrating to people who know Hebrew, you know, if they were ever in any doubt, demonstrating what words were supplied, but actually that doesn't help anybody who doesn't know Hebrew. So I'm for italics too, but probably let's keep them in the New American Standard Bible, which is sort of our place where we collect all these odd conventions. I actually have a video coming out about this with Word Nerd at the beginning of December, probably December 1st, Lord willing. And I was just noting all of the conventions they have, like small capping the word Lord. That's a pretty standard one. Most translations do that, and I'm okay with that. Small capping Old Testament quotations throughout the Bible, not just the New Testament, even when the Old Testament quotes the Old Testament. Okay, well, that's helpful, but it also requires some interpretation, you know, capitalizing deity pronouns. We've got all these little tricks to try to overcome a barrier that God gave us, which is that no one language perfectly maps onto another. You're gonna, at some point, hit the limit of what your language can do. For example, I talk about this in this video coming out. In 2 Timothy 3, Paul says to Timothy, remember the things thou hast learned, considering from whom thou hast learned them. Well, whom can be singular or plural in Greek, but it can't in English. And though I've heard countless people tell me it's extremely important that we hold on to the King James Version because it alone preserves the all-important distinction between second person singular and plural pronouns, you know, thee versus ye. Okay, that's a benefit. I've never heard a single one of them ever mention the all-important distinction between whom that's singular and whom that's plural. Well, it's just the way language is. You know, at some point, I say in this video, lexicons and commentaries and study Bibles are going to have to pick up at the level of detail where our translations leave off, and we're just going to have to be okay with that. And okay, so yeah, it's nice. I really do like it, and I do use it sometimes to know that the King James lets me know that, you know, thee is a singular you and you is a plural you. Fine. I wonder how many King James readers actually know that, by the way. I was never taught it growing up. Learned that as a college student, but okay. But you weigh that value. Yeah, that's valuable. You weigh that value against other values, like the value of understanding the Bible on a first read in a given passage, the value of having, of getting rid of the dead words and false friends, replacing them with words that we already know. And people want to make it a zero-sum game where we've got to have the absolute most accurate translation. And all this work of mine has actually led me to say, you know, everybody just better calm down. Other than the New World Translation and maybe some liberal or other versions, nobody's like trying to trick you. They're just trying to get the meaning of the Bible across to you, rather than going on a lifelong hunt for the best, most accurate English Bible. Why not accept the embarrassment of riches that we have and do what I've done for the last 20 years? And you can sort of see it. Actually, it's right up there. That pink spine, that's my comparative. I'm going to grab it down. This is my comparative study Bible. Here we go. I'm back in focus. I bought this July of 1999. I wrote it in the front. This is the property of Mark Ward Jr., July 1999. I stamped Authorized in there because my coworkers at work gave me an Authorized stamp after I wrote my book. I paid $50 at Crossway Christian Supply, and it has in 4 columns the King James, the Amplified, the New American Standard, and the NIV. So it's been 21 years that I have been comparing Bible translations, and this thing is full of notes. And a ton of those notes are basically saying, oh, now I get it, because I compared multiple translations. I was not mired in confusion. I wasn't left thinking, oh no, what's the standard? What should I believe? Over and over and over and over again, I just went, oh, because I checked a more formal translation, the NASB and the King James, and I checked a more dynamic or functional one, the NIV, and a weird one, the Amplified Bible, which I'm not a big fan of, but it still had some.
It's louder than other Bibles, right?
Yeah, the Amplified Bible. I'm not sure how many amps are in it, actually. Yeah. It's just, you know, people are so afraid, and I do understand. I'm not putting them down. I understand. They're like, I don't want anybody touching God's words between the time it comes from his mouth and into my ears. I get that, but that is the situation God himself in his goodness gave us. You're going to have to trust somebody. And I hear my King James only brothers all the time saying, I don't want to have to trust the scholars. And I want to say, no, brother, who do you think the King James translators were? They were scholars. Okay, well, they were godlier than any other scholar and smarter than any other scholar we could possibly have today. And I just want to say, you know, how could you possibly know that, brother? It isn't true, but how could you judge that without knowing Hebrew and Greek and being a scholar yourself? I'd like to see people calm down, get some humility, and build trust in things that have just benefited me over and over again. People say, I don't want to look at those other translations. And I just say, you could pry this from my cold, dead hands because of all the benefit I've gotten from it. I just want to understand the Bible. That's what my King James only brothers taught me to do. And I'm urging them to just live true to their principles and do the same thing.
Good. Yeah, and ironically, not everybody liked the King James version when it came out.
Yeah, if you read the preface, they are so defensive. The King James translators, in fact, they wrote the sign that I put over all of King James onlyism. When they wrote the sentence, cavil, if it do not find a hole, will make one. In other words, petty objections, that's what a cavil is. If people can't actually find a fault in something, they're gonna make up their petty objections. And when I read lengthy articles just bashing the New King James Version, I try to get the very best representatives of the King James only viewpoint, the people with the most training, who are the most responsible and careful. Well, I went through a very lengthy attack, actually two of them, on the New King James Version by the very best people in King James only circles, men who really are gifted. I don't care to deny that whatsoever. These are smart men. They know Hebrew and Greek. And over again, I kept thinking what the King James translators said. They're just coming up with petty objections. Okay, yes, somebody could possibly misunderstand the way the New King James translated this here, but somebody could have just as easily misunderstood the way the King James translated it here. You're never going to be able to translate in such a way that absolutely eliminates all possibility of misunderstanding. People say that the King James, boy, I'm really off on a tear. I'm sorry, Tim.
No, that's fine.
One more thing. People say the King James preserves us from all of the doctrinal error that comes. And I just want to say, back in the 19th century, we had the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were reading the King James Version too. In fact, the King James Version, parts of Isaiah landed in the Book of Mormon, word for word. Having the supposedly perfect Bible translation didn't stop us from having doctrinal error back then. And having the NIV isn't going to stop us from having it now. It's not the translation. People can twist even the very best, even a perfect translation, to say whatever they want it to say. That's up to humans. It's not the fault of the translations.
Yeah, I had
evangelical English ones, I
had a student once who actually said that the Book of Mormon is King James Version fan fiction. I thought
that's fantastic. That's great.
Well,
right. It sounds like the King James, right?
It does, yeah.
I've gotten several notes from Mormons who've read my book, and I was really surprised by this. There's King James onlyism within Mormonism. They treat it as holy and sacred.
That's true, yeah.
Why would they use King James Elizabethan English from the late 16th and early 17th centuries in a 19th century English translation? It's obvious, because that language carries religious authority in English-speaking culture.
Yep.
But I'm just saying it shouldn't. There's no reason why we can't use our English to translate what God has said.
Yeah. So I think a good way to kind of wind this conversation down is, first of all, to acknowledge that, again, we both really love and value and treasure the King James Version. We acknowledge it, and I think we both use it to some degree.
Every day.
But I think we would also say that the King James translators had principles that led them to create an updated translation. And if they were here
Absolutely.
today using these same principles, they would probably be recommending that we use a newer translation than the King James Version itself. So, what would you say people should be looking for in a translation today? And what would the King James translators probably tell us? What kind of advice might they give?
Yeah, I stand on especially two Bible passages whenever I think of the necessity of translation and the shape of Bible translation. One is Matthew 28, the Great Commission. Jesus says he wants us to his apostles, and we've all, most Christians have taken this to apply to us too, to teach the nations to observe everything that Jesus has commanded. And throughout the history of the Christian church, although Jesus doesn't specify that this means Bible translation, we've always taken it to mean that, among many other things, of course. We have to have pastors and evangelists and missionaries. But missionaries often end up translating the Bible. And now around the world, of course, we're working on hundreds of translation projects, Christians are. I do think that translation arises out of the need to disciple the nations. And I mean, just the nature of the case, you don't, in a way, you don't have to have a Bible passage telling you this, but we will in a second. If you're going to translate it, why would you translate it into a version of the language that nobody in the culture speaks anymore? Wouldn't you want to use the words that they use and the syntax that they use, if the whole goal is getting them to understand? Because that's how we serve, teaching the nations to observe what Jesus commanded. Okay. Then 1 Corinthians 14, I've gotten a ton of flack for this. And I've really, again, searched my heart to say, and my commentaries and Logos, am I interpreting this accurately? But 1 Corinthians 14, Paul takes a principle, edification requires intelligibility, and he applies it to tongue speaking. And he says, therefore, we should have no untranslated tongues in the services. Well, we're cessationists, most of the people that I deal with in a day in, day out basis. Not all, but most of us. And does that passage have nothing to do with us because we don't have tongues anymore anyway? No, because it's the application of a principle that Paul makes abundantly clear, which is edification requires intelligibility. How can you possibly build people up if they don't understand? And so I asked the question, okay, would Paul be okay with us replacing one out of every 35 words in church with an archaic word that nobody understands because tradition? I think he'd say, well, no, I said edification requires intelligibility. And you could come back to Paul and say, well, it's the same language, people just need to buck up and use a dictionary. And I think Paul would say, well, if you can use a word that people know, if you can say broom, why are you saying besom? And then I think what Jesus said, you have a clever way of letting your tradition make void the word of God. Quite literally, all these false friends and dead words are void because of our good tradition that we've kind of let become increasingly naked emperor. So I stand on Matthew 28, 1 Corinthians 14. My conscience is captive to these passages, and I absolutely stand with the King James translators. And I have read their preface multiple times. It's absolutely brilliant. I made a YouTube video abridging and translating it. Everything I say in that video comes straight from them. It's just translated into our English. I gave some reflections on it. Absolutely, the King James translators were not King James only. They had exactly the same Tyndalean heartbeat that I have. They just want to make the well of water in Canaan available to all the people who come to the well.
That's great. And we have a variety of options today to help with that. And I think at the end of your book, you actually have a list of different translations that you would point people to. So what are some of those translations?
If you go to your local Christian bookstore and look at the shelf, they've already winnowed out for you all of the stuff that's idiosyncratic or weird or not worth your time. Pretty much any evangelical English Bible translation is going to have valid uses. Maybe it isn't what's best for your church. Maybe it's a private study tool like the New Living Translation. I wouldn't want my church to use that as a preaching Bible. Although I used the New International Reader's Version, which is the NIV with shorter sentences, when I was the pastor for 5.5 years of a outreach congregation to people who were functionally illiterate, kind of the downtrodden of society. It was awesome.
Mm.
Any major evangelical English Bible translation, I know the scholars behind them, in some cases personally, like Vern Poythress and Wayne Grudem, is worthy of your trust. Is it perfect? No. The King James wasn't perfect, but worthy of your trust. Absolutely.
That's good. Yes, and so definitely Christian bookstores, and I think on both of our channels, YouTube, we talk about translations so people will discover good resources. And thank you so much, Mark. It's been such an honor and a privilege and a joy to have this conversation with you and talk about your book. An excellent, excellent book. I really do love it. Authorized: The Use and Misuse of the King James Bible. Thank you so much. I hope that maybe at some point we can talk again sometime.
That would be fantastic. And I wish you success and fruit that remains on your YouTube channel.
Thank you so much.